Hey guys, Turk here. I hope you're having a glorious day. Now, we're currently sitting in a lull of hardware releases while we wait patiently for Nvidia to launch their RTX 3060s, AMD to announce their Navi 22 cards, and Intel's attempt to dethrone AMD's latest processors. While I prepped for these releases, I've been revisiting my benchmarking setups and it dawned on me. Why do I use the games I use in my review videos? With that in mind, today we're going to be launching our newest series, Benchmarking the Benchmarks. When I run my benchmarks, I always want to pick the best tests that emphasize a product's strengths and their weaknesses to better inform you guys. We test demanding games like Red Dead Redemption 2 for our GPU reviews, and for our CPU, we lean on the classics like GTA 5 and Ashes of the Singularity. But why do we do that? And today, I will answer those questions while dissecting the CPU, GPU, and memory scaling in our first game under the microscope, Gears 5. Gears 5 was released back in September of 2019 for the Xbox and PC. It inherits the franchise's cover shooter mechanics while ramping up the visuals and story delivered by the developer, The Coalition. This game has received mostly positive reviews, and on PC it has consistently shown itself an independent and marketing material from various outlets for us PC hardware enthusiasts. Gears 5 supports a broad spectrum of hardware, ranging from AMD GPUs from back in 2014 to the ideal candidate being the RTX 2080. Though no CPU frequencies are listed, Gears 5 prefers matching up the blue and green team, while AMD's product portfolio matches nicely with the intended specs. For CPUs, they reference the architectures on their requirements chart, so as long as you're running a CPU that's, 5 to 6 years old, chances are you should be okay. More on that in just a bit. Gears 5 is heralded mainly as a GPU-intensive game, so let's collect a little bit of data, standardize our procedures, and make some initial observations on how the game performs. I'm going to be using my Intel Z490 test bench here today, which utilizes the 10700K, RTX 3080, and 4 sticks of DDR4 3466. I'll be tweaking each of these components to better understand how they can impact the game's overall performance. I'll also be showing 1080p, 1440p, and 4K resolutions to get ourselves a complete dataset. Let's start on the high end with our 10700K, 3080, and overclocked memory configuration. At 1080p and 1440p, it looks like we're hitting a bottleneck, giving us practically the same results at low, medium, and high detail settings. Fortunately, the Ultra preset scales well at 1080p, and 1440p manages to stay above 60 FPS even with the 5% low results. As for 4K, this game, it is stunning, and we obtain nearly a guaranteed 60 FPS at all presets, if it wasn't for that snooping Ultra preset. Downgrading our GPU to our ASUS RX 5600 XT provides an intriguing story that 4K is actually quite playable even at decent detail presets. The game struggles to use the 5600 XT at 1440p, but maintains above 75 FPS at high or lower detail settings. 1080p, solid win for the 5600 XT. On the entry-level side of things, our GTX 1650 Super surprisingly manages well at 1440p, but clearly favors the lower HD resolutions. With this GPU, it maintains 60 FPS with high detail settings, and honestly guys, I would not recommend the low setting, even if the performance is that good. For a GPU benchmark, we clearly see the improvement in frame rate as we increase our GPU capability. Let's see if it's the CPU that's holding us back. There's a couple of different variables we can change on the CPU to alter performance, and for us, that's the core clock frequency and the number of cores. Let's start with the obvious setting, the frequency. Locking our processor to a specific clock ratio, we take 500 MHz steps from an all-core 5 GHz down to 2 GHz. This will hopefully help highlight the differences between desktop and some laptop processors. Between 5 GHz and 4.5, we are maxed out at 1440p and 1080p, suggesting that we might be hitting a GPU bottleneck. Continuing down the frequency curve, we do start to see the 1080p and 1440p frame rates falling off linearly. But how about that 4K result? It looks like, given the GPU bottleneck we saw in our previous chart, we can safely run optimally around 3.5 GHz. With that said, pretty much any processor in the recommended chart should be capable of excellent gameplay, given the architecture is up for the task. I'm looking at you, Piledriver. Now, how about core count? Many YouTubers, including myself, are recommending higher quantities of cores, but does this game really need it? Sure enough, Gears 5 scales very well at 1080p and 1440p with core count increases, though it does look like after we hit 6 cores, we are hitting diminishing returns. What's more impressive is that either of those resolutions, we see 16 percentage point improvement, going from 4 to 8 cores at 1080p and 12 percentage points at 1440p. Shockingly, 4K only requires about 4 cores, which just goes to show that some of the console designs are actually well outfitted for this particular engine. This particular test clearly solidifies our recommendation of not using this game as a CPU benchmarking tool and enhances our recommendation that older CPUs are still a legitimate choice for some games out there, even with lower clocks and core count. If you guys have been following me on my other channels, you know that I am just not a fan of overclocking memory or tweaking timings. However, on our community tab, you guys wanted to see me include some memory scaling results, and I think it is a good time as any to see if fancy timings or data rates are worth the money. Memory scaling can be broken down into 3 different types: capacity, speed, latency. Since I don't have access to RAM with impressive timings, I'll be focusing on the first 2 in this installment of Benchmarking the Benchmark. Let me know down in the comments if there's a kit of RAM you would recommend. Let's do an easy test, changing our data rates. In this test, we'll be equipping all 4 RAM sticks and, with the default XMP timings, step them down from an overclocked DDR4 3600 down to a JEDEC standard of 2400. It shouldn't come as a shock that with 4K, we see hardly any change in frame rate as we walk the memory speeds. But for 1440p and 1080p, we see measurable improvements between each step. Though not massive gains, they are enough to maybe sway you one way or the other. Let's throw capacity in. Again, 4K is not a huge concern given the massive GPU bottleneck, but doubling from 8 gigs of 3600 to 16 gigs nets a 12 percentage point increase, which also bumps up our 5% minimum frame rates to 11 percentage points. But here's an exciting twist. Let's combine both of these factors. Now those are some intriguing results. For any budget builders looking to start with 8 gigs of RAM and move to better kits, that upgrade path is solid. A single stick of 8 gigs at 3600 nearly matches a poor quality 16 or 32 gigs. If you upgrade, that 13 FPS improvement is obtainable. Of course, this uses the RTX 3080, so don't expect as optimistic results in the upgrade. But what does this say about Gears 5? In summary, memory data rates scale nicely for the engine, though capacity isn't as crucial after installing 16 gigs. This also proves that this game is an excellent candidate for validating if a budget system config is worthwhile, with ample room for upgrades. Lastly, should we rely on the Gears 5 built-in benchmark tool, or dedicate time to in-game gameplay? The in-game benchmark takes right around a minute to run, and it includes rather stressful segments of Act 2 into the mix. This is a key component to product reviewers since we need multiple data sets and we have so many setups to run. The built-in benchmarking tool also reports some very helpful statistics, such as the average CPU render time, our GPU render time, and of course, 5% minimum frame rates. All of the data collected today was used with the built-in benchmarking tool, and I've only seen about 5 FPS variance in the average frame rates for all of the tests today. Now, how about the gameplay? I've seen frame rates anywhere between 74 FPS in a gunfight and 111 when walking through a dark cavern with my gameplay. While using my RX 5600 XT at 1440p, we come remarkably close to the reported average frame rate through the tool. Now, I've only played through the first few parts of Act 2 in Gears 5, but it's safe to say that the benchmarking tool is a conservative estimate at average frame rates. With all the data in hand, what do I think about Gears 5 as a benchmarking tool? Clearly, this game is a GPU limited. As for 4K, it looks like this benchmark has a few more years left in it. The last point of consideration is memory scaling. If you see benchmark data online for a configuration that you might be using, be cautious about assuming that their results will translate to your setup. This game could be useful also for some memory reviews, so we might be circling back to Gears 5 in no time. And if you see Gears 5 in a CPU review, don't put too much weight into the result. This game can use some really outdated hardware to run very effectively. Well, there you have it, guys. That's my Gears 5 benchmarking the benchmark video. I hope you've enjoyed it. It has taken me a whole lot of time to collect all this data, so make sure you hit the follow button. This isn't Twitch. Hit the subscribe button down below to make sure you're following the channel here, but also go check me out over on Twitch. We've been playing a lot of Gears 5 lately in order to collect some of this gameplay data. So if you want to be a part of the process or participate with the Turk Force, you know, Twitch is a good start, but jumping into our Discord is a great place to just talk about general tech stuff all the time. So guys, thank you for coming by the video. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll catch you in the next one, Turk Force.